In the next 20 minutes, we're going to start your journey towards using your blueprint knowledge to get optimized C++ code. Blueprints are a very easy way to get started in Unreal Engine, and many of us, including myself, really enjoy using blueprints. Now, a lot of people, when they're talking about using C++ alongside of blueprints, a lot of people see it as a more binary option. But the reality of it is most developers, even those at AAA studios, are going to use a mixture of it. Now, depending on whether you're more on the designer side or more on the programming side determines how much you live in which environment. But especially smaller solo indie devs, you're going to be using a lot of both. So let's talk about how we can integrate C++ in either existing Blueprint projects or in brand new ones. Now, something I'm going to do here from scratch is I'm going to create a whole brand new project in Blueprint, specifically so I can show you how to set up and connect to your actual code so you can see C++. But this can be done in an existing project already. I'm going to show you the exact way I did it in my own project so you can see how and follow along. While that's compiling in the background, let's go ahead and actually jump into something that you're going to need to download and install, and that is going to be your IDE. An IDE is an integrated development engine. Basically, it's any kind of coding platform that lets you write out your code. And the cool thing is with Unreal Engine, it's relatively flexible in terms of selecting what IDE you want to use. The big thing is you're going to want to make sure to look at IDEs that are compatible with Unreal Engine, or maybe have a plugin that you can use to use it with Unreal Engine. So the big ones are going to be Visual Studio Code, which a lot of people talk about as being not working with Unreal Engine, but actually Unreal actually provides their own breakdown on how to get it set up for Unreal Engine. And then Writer. So those are the three most common ones that I've seen. Personally, I'm more of a fan of Visual Studio, but I think that's more because when I went through computer science courses, this is what was used. I got comfortable with it. I like it. It's not perfect, definitely, and it's just very sluggish at times, but I really enjoy using it. Writer is the one that a lot of people recommend for people because it is a very advanced tool and has a lot of really good quality of life things. And then Visual Studio Code is one that's usually recommended not to use, mostly because with how lightweight Visual Studio Code is, it tends to miss out on a lot of the more in-depth tools that come with other IDEs. Now, of course, you can use whichever one you want. Writer does cost money. The other two are free, and they even have free plugins for Unreal Engine themselves. You have to use the community version for Visual Studios, but Visual Studio Code is free for everybody. There's certain licenses and things, but as far as I'm aware, all of them are pretty generous, and you don't need to worry about really anything with these, at least not until you get big enough to actually have to worry about that. Writer itself does cost money, I believe, for non-commercial use. Yeah, free for non-commercial use. So if you're just making a game to learn, or if you're making an educational game, you can use this. But if you're going to actually make any money or charge people for it, you need to make sure that you get the actual license for it. But yeah, once you have that downloaded, what you're going to want to do is go into your engine, and then up here you're going to have a few different options that you can select from. The most important thing, though, we're going to want to look at is the actual I believe it's under editor preferences. So there's something called the source code. And under here, this is where you can actually select the correct editor. So let's say you've gone ahead and swapped out Visual Studio for a different option. You can go ahead and select it under here. Now, I believe by default, this just shows whatever current editors you have loaded in. So if you have an editor that is outside of that, you'll have to do some minor modifications. I believe so long as you have it installed, it should be able to be picked up by the editor. But I'm not 100% sure on that. You may have to go look up more specifics if you're using something outside of the standards that they provide here. All right. So once you've gone ahead, you've gotten that link to the correct IDE, then what you want to do is go ahead and get started with a C++ class. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this my C++ folder. We'll go in here and create a new C++. Actually, we'll go up here, go to a new C++ class, And now what's going to happen here is we're going to create something. So for now, let's go with something like a function library. I like to always have a function library. That's the first class I always create. It's something that's super handy to get you into C++ and get you into Unreal Engine. And so I just like to create one off the bat. And we're just going to call this our general function library. It's always good to break them up a little bit if you're going to have a few different ones. And we'll go ahead and create class. And what this is going to do is it does a couple of things on the back end. But essentially, it basically tells Unreal Engine, hey, this might have started as a Blueprint project, whatever Blueprint you have in here. But we're going to be moving to doing C++ as well. Now, the cool thing is, like, a lot of this is automatic and very easy to do because the engine is built with C++ in mind. Whenever you're selecting a Blueprint versus C++ project, it's not necessarily limiting the project one way or another. What it's doing is just setting up the initial files because, of course, if you are doing it in C++, you already know that you need to build from the IDE and things like that. And so it's just the way that it's initially set up. So you can see here, now that we've got it, it says, hey, this includes sources. Please go ahead and close the editor and build from IDE. So, of course, we'll go ahead and we'll close the editor and get the IDE actually up and running. So we'll give it a second to actually load in the project. All right. You can ignore this for now. That's something from my own personal installation. So what you're going to see here when you first load up is nothing's probably selected. And you've got a whole lot of stuff going off on the side. And so now you want to do is actually go ahead and find that file. Now, we've even got a few things here as far as plugins, automation tools. A lot of this sometimes will come open. And the big thing we're going to want to look for is close all of these. And we want to go into our game, into our source folder, and we've got a couple things here. So what this is this is the project target and editor target. So we go ahead and look at these. These basically tell the engine, hey, here are the targets for the editor. Here's the targets for an actual build. And then basically it takes the default build settings and you can change these, tweak these, but I wouldn't do that until you really understand what these are for. But essentially these tell the engine when you're building this, here's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the editor versus I'm looking at the game. But as you can see here, over here, we've got a few other things. So we've got our project build specific. So if we go ahead and let it load. But yeah, so this is our dependencies. So for example, when you are doing things inside of your code, there are certain dependencies that are needed to actually build your project. For example, if I was going to use, let's say Niagara here in the code, to actually access that, you've got to use your includes, but on top of that, you also need to use a dependency. But we'll get more into that once we actually start creating blueprints and things like that, because we're going to create some blueprints. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at our function library. So this is the new class that we created. Now you're going to have two different files here that get created. You're going to have your function library.h. This is your header file. So while this tutorial is meant for blueprinters, I'm not going to try and get too deep into the weeds in coding specifics, but we are going to talk about these a bit because these are some pretty important concepts. So you're going to have your .h file, your header file, and your CPP file. So basically what these are your public facing and your private facing parts of that class. The public side is what is part of the reflection system. So in Unreal Engine, there is something called the reflection system. Basically, it is how your stuff in code gets to the actual blueprint side. It's here's what I have in code, here's what's in blueprint. With that, there are some limitations and some caveats for certain things. For example, in C++, you can use const chars all the time when you're building something that is built maybe in a different engine, or if you're building like a standalone project. Const chars are a very common variable, but with Unreal Engine in the front end side, quote unquote, and on the actual blueprint side, a const char isn't a valid variable type. So instead, you're going to need to use something that is an Unreal specific variable. So that is something like an f string. Now, we'll get more into that once we start creating functions and things like that, but I just wanted to briefly talk about that this here is your header. This is where you're going to create those kind of reflected types. On the other side, we have our CPP. This is where the actual function definitions live. Here you can have const chars, and you can even have whole functions here in the header. So long as they are not reflected to Unreal Engine, you can have them use these standard CPP things like const chars. It's just that they can't be run from within the engine. So they can't be blueprint visible, blueprint editable, things like that. Instead, you'll need to have a wrapper function if you want to create a function using those. But we'll talk more on that in a little bit. Let's just jump back into the engine. So what we're going to want to do now that we've created our project, we've got our files here, we've loaded our source code. What we want to go ahead and do is up here, you're going to see a few different things. So you're going to see over here, we've got our development. I believe it says development editor, but unfortunately, for the last 20 years, Visual Studio has cut this off. And then you've got Win64, of course, depending on if you're developing in other like Linux or things like that, you'll want to select the correct one. This is our current project. You could also use Automated Tool and things like this. These aren't necessarily useful for us. We're just going to leave it to the default on the project, which is to the solution. So now we've got everything set up. We should be able to hit startup and start without debug, and that'll go ahead and build an editor for us. So sometimes running it in with the debugger running is very helpful because there is a concept known as a subsystem. Now with things like Discord and other systems, you can create these subsystems that basically start when the editor or engine, when you're actually running the game, launch. And those are useful for things when you are doing things that don't necessarily need to be, or they can be, but they don't necessarily need to be in game time, like in the game world. So for example, with Discord, when my games start, I actually have a subsystem that launches that's the Discord game subsystem that will then reach out to Discord and say, hey, they're playing my game now, show this message. And then when they get into a level, it says show a different message. And because it's a subsystem, I can execute that code within the actual engine itself using blueprints. And we'll show that a little bit, but let's actually take a look. Now we've got our game. We launched it, we started it up. Everything's pretty much ready to go. But you can see here, there's no C++ classes in here. And that's because our C++ classes go inside of an actual folder. And within here, you can create more classes, but this is very useful for storing all of your C++ classes. But whenever you create an actor or a character or anything like that, the C++ class will live here, but that's not actually where you're going to have the blueprint version of that class live. So to kind of show that off, let's go ahead and just create a very basic class here for the beginning, just kind of show off. We'll just do something very simple. We'll just do a pawn because we're going to talk about input at some point. We'll call it my new pawn and create class. Now, of course, when you're working with C++, one of the big things you want to think about is how often you're needing to reload the editor. Now, of course, especially with a better system, it doesn't necessarily take a super long time, anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute, depending on the specific computer you have and things like that. But there's something called live coding. Live coding is a great tool, but you do need to be careful when using it. So now you can see here by default, it's something that's on in the engine because it's something very, very handy. But the big thing you want to be careful of, especially for things like function libraries where you're editing the header file, you need to be careful because if you start editing the header file willy-nilly and making a lot of changes, what can happen is you'll suddenly find that you come back to the engine because it was still open, the editor was still open, and something has broken. Whether that has gotten corrupted or an entire actor is just missing because the C++ code broke the blueprint version, which then just completely corrupted it and it got completely removed. It has improved a lot, especially over the days of hot reloading. There used to be something called hot reloading in Unreal Engine. That was at least the times that I used it when I was first learning Unreal Engine, it was a hot garbage fire. It is a lot better now with live coding. You can actually get away with a lot more than you used to be able to, but if you're ever uncertain, it's always better to just close the editor down and restart, because you'd rather not lose all of your hard work. So let's go ahead and take a look. So you can see here we created this new pawn, and it comes with some basic stuff. For example, here this is called the constructor, and inside of here we're just setting the primary actor tick can ever tick to true. It's got a begin play, calling the super begin play, and then calling tick as well. And then from here we're just setting up the input player component. All very simple stuff. As you can see here, this is the public function. So this is basically saying, hey, these are the default values. Go ahead and run the constructor. Here's the protected begin play, because this is not something you want to be able to call outside of the code in here. And then we have some more public functions here with tick and set up player input component. Now, if we go ahead and look inside of here, this isn't the kind of C++ class that you can just drag in here. I mean, if you do, it will work, but what's happening here is it's not actually dragging the C++ class. What it's doing is it's creating a blueprint instance. So what we can do then, instead of just dragging it in and needing to edit things directly, what we can do is create a blueprint class based on my new pawn system. So go ahead and create this, and we'll just call it my new pawn. We'll call it BP underscore my new pawn. And then I'm going to put this in the C++ folder we created earlier. Create my new class, and boom. Now we've got access to everything you'd ever want inside of Blueprints, all based around that C++ class. Now the cool thing is, if we close the editor down and go in here and edit a whole bunch of stuff like add functions and things or add variables, we can see that populate over here. So let's actually do that briefly here before we end the episode. So we're going to close the editor here, make sure it's fully closed down. And within here, let's go ahead and create some public variables. All right, there we go. I wanted to make sure I had the different uProperty documentation up next to me. So let's go ahead and kick it off. So let's say we wanted to create a variable here, exposed to the blueprint. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. Let's just, let's do a float. So we'll say uProperty, and then we'll do edit anywhere, blueprint read write category. Now this category is a way to group variables together. So if you're creating a class that has a handful of variables, especially larger classes who might have more complex variables, you want to make sure and categorize them so it's a little bit easier to access. You can also add this category to functions. So if you need to call a function, you can also do so and search for it via the category. So we're going to create this variable here. We're going to give it the category base stats, and we'll just call this health. And we need to make sure, to add, if I can spell today. So we're going to have it be a float and its health. Now you can set defaults depending on what you want to do. And the way to do that is just to say, hey, the default float for health is 100. And from here, then when we load up the engine here in a moment, we'll see this. One thing we're also going to want to do is I also want to create a function. So we'll also do a function here. We'll call this uFunction. And this has basically very similar things, but instead of being blueprint read write, it's blueprint callable. You can also make it blueprint pure and things like that. In fact, we'll actually get, we'll get the health through this. So we're going to call this as a blueprint pure. And then we'll give it a category, call this, we'll leave it the same. We'll call it base stats, because this is a caller for the base stats. And to get this, we're going to need to return a float And we're going to return a float. We're going to call this function get health. And then we need to do this. Now, what we've created here is a getter and setter. Now, right now, the health is a public variable, but for something like health, you're probably going to want that to be either protected or private to make sure that it's only accessed in ways that you're allowing it to be accessed through getters and setters. By having it be exposed, you make it very easy to just access it anywhere, and that's not necessarily the best practice. So let's go ahead and now that we've got this get health, we actually need to define what get health is, right? We can't just type get health in the engine to know what that means. We actually need to create what's known as a definition. So hit create definition. And we're going to return here, instead of returning just 0, we're actually going to return that health. So we're returning that variable saying, hey, here's our health. So let's go ahead and restart our engine. So we'll go ahead and kick it back off, start without debugging. And of course, once you learn the key bindings, it's very easy to restart, All right. So let's actually open up our pawn here. So if we hit open full editor, as you can see here, we have our health base stats over here. That's 100. And let's say, on start, we want to get health. Now, as you can see, it might not always show up. It depends on, oh, that's right. Sorry, my brain was in another place. So to get health, because it's a pure, we're actually going to have to type in get health off of here because we're not using the execution. But then at that point, we can print string and go ahead and get health. But yeah, so that is the basics of how to start off in C++. If you have any questions, leave them down below. This should get you most of the way there to at least getting started. If you have any questions, we are going to be continuing a series talking more in depth about things like converting actors from BP to C++, more about the reflection system and the different variables you can and can't use, the different what are known as meta elements of the uproperties, ufunctions, what you can use them for, and the different ways to return that information, things like that. But yeah, that's it for today. If you have any other questions, leave them down below. But otherwise, good luck and good hunting.